I've assembled a few of the more popular woodworking joints. This is a box joint. This one is dovetail. I have half flap over here, and finally mortise and tenon. This is our box joint. Now this joint can be created a couple of different ways. On the table saw for one, which is how I did this one, or on a router. And you can vary the spacing of these joints and their depth depending upon what you're looking for. The fit on these, and whichever tool you use, should be firm enough that you can put it together with your hand without beating it, but also not so loose that it falls apart. Once I do my layouts, and I'm pretty happy with the way that this is going together and I like the looks of them, I will mark each one of these for their position so I can put it back in that spot. So I have the back and the front and the left and the right. This allows me to reassemble it. So I'm setting my pieces in order on a piece of wax paper to keep from getting glue on the workbench. I'm putting a piece of blue tape on each one of the joints. That will protect those joints from squeeze out. Now I'm applying glue in a counterclockwise rotation, starting at the first joint and working my way all the way around, and then assembling these joints in that same order. I'm using a mallet in some places because it's a little bit tougher to get those joints together, especially with some glue in them. And as I place the clamps, I want to make sure that the clamps are placed just behind the joint itself. This allows that joint to protrude very slightly onto the face grain on each one of those edges. I'll put all 4 clamps together and then slowly tighten each one of those clamps. That allows those joints to fully compress into their respective spots, and finally to make sure that the entire glue up rests flat on the tabletop. In this case, I've got clamps that sit flat on the table, and as long as my glue up sits flat in the clamps, I know that the ultimate glue up will be flat. Lastly, I'm taking a damp rag and wiping down all the exposed joints. These will be sanded flush and smooth later. I just pulled this out of the clamps and decided to sand one face. See how beautifully that end grain contrasts with the face grain there. And if you remember when we started, I suggested having these pins exposed just a bit on the end. And once they're sanded, they provide a beautiful look. And then lastly, let's pull off some of the tape on the inside edge here, and to see how well the inside of this box was protected. Probably one of the most iconic joints in woodworking is a dovetail, and this is it here. This is considered a half-blind dovetail. You don't see it from the front, and that's so you can allow the beauty of your design and maybe your wood selection to show. Mechanically, what happens is that the side is locked into the front, and the front cannot pull away from the sides, and that's the reason it's used an awful lot in drawer construction. So no matter how much stress is on that drawer, you'll never be able to move the front away from the back. Now this joint can be cut on a dovetail jig, which is how I did it, or you can also cut it by hand. This is what the joint actually looks like. The pins and tails slide together like this, and their fit should be tight enough that a mallet sets them, but they're not so loose that they'll fall apart. The better fit that joint, the better the glue works. But again, mechanically, the front cannot pull away from the sides. Being a standard drawer construction, the way I like to make them, I have the dovetails in the front because that's where all the stress is, and I have a simple rabbited joint in the back because there's no real stress on the back of this drawer that would cause a problem. And in fact, if I were making this as a drawer, there'd be a groove around the inside bottom edge here that would allow the panel that of course would hold the things in the drawer from falling through. So that's the idea behind that joint. Again, it's become kind of the hallmark of craftsmanship. And most woodworkers, once they accomplish this joint, will never go back to the standard one. It's a great joint to work with. It's a good looking joint when you're done. Here's how you set it up, here's how you glue it, and here's how you clamp it. This is a pretty simple and straightforward glue up, so I'm not terribly concerned about how much time it'll take me to assemble this joint. I'll start by putting a good amount inside each one of the sockets and then put the sides onto it and then insert the back. Now when I put the clamps on, I want to make sure that they're standing just beyond the actual joint. I like to make sure that the end grain is just slightly proud of the face grain on the sides. I'll tighten those just a bit and then check my square. Once I'm happy that the box is square, I'll finish tightening the clamps. That way I've got even pressure on all those sides. The joint looks great right now. We'll see how it looks when we take the clamps off. Now again, I pulled these out of the clamps and I spent just a minute or so sanding the edge of this, again, where the end grain was slightly proud of the face. And these dovetails cleaned up beautifully. The look is very nice and the joint is even better. This will never come apart. Your choice of glues and the construction of that joint make this a perfect and very, very permanent joint. Now, for all you eagle-eyed people, if you notice on the end here, again, this is all glued up. These end grains are slightly proud of the side, but you'll notice that there's very tiny, almost hairline marks where this joint is not complete. And no matter how good you are at any of this joinery, you're going to find those little spots in there. So here's a quick tip on how to kind of fix that. So I'm just going to take a little bit of glue and I'm going to just very light glue spot in any of those openings I see. Now press it into those openings. And before the glue dries, and while it's still tacky, I'll sand that joint. That was quick, but the results make this all but perfect. This joint is called a half-lap joint, where one side overhangs the other. And its purpose is to take the place of this. This would be end grain to end grain, and there's really no good glue surface there, and this would be an inherently weak joint. But by taking this wood and cutting them back, I provided much more glue surface, and this joint, in effect, is having done the same as this. So the idea first here is that, of course, these had to be machined down so that once they're glued up that they're flat. The other thing is that whether it's cut at a table saw or whether or not it's cut on a dado blade, make sure that these edges here, which can be somewhat serrated, are sanded down. The smoother that joint, the better the joint. In this case, I have these before I've sanded them down, and you can actually see the marks from the dado blade. This is not a bad joint, but it's certainly not going to be as strong as one where the ends have been cleaned up. And secondly, when I put this together, those slightly serrated edges are going to show up on the end here, and it really doesn't make for a nice look. If on the other hand we do this, and these edges are smoother, you get a much nicer seam where you almost make that wood blend. Now, one of the ways is this way to extend a board. This one is taking a half lap and actually joining wood like this. So again, this would take the place of this or this. And in these, yes, you could use a biscuit joint, you could use dowels, but this is a very nice, exceptionally strong joint because of all the glue surface area. And again, these have been cleaned up to make them as smooth as possible, and that joint will be exceptionally strong. And last, if you're planning on putting a board together and in effect you're just making for a longer board, you're still going to do the same process as we talked about before. You're still going to make sure that these edges are nice and smooth, but to make sure that after you glue it, it's going to be in a nice straight line. My suggestion is clamp these like I have here to a known flat surface and run them up against the edge of a known straight edge. So if I put some glue on here, all I'm going to do is put enough glue on here to cover that joint, and I'll still put it on one side. Now this is the glue surface area. If you want to, you can put glue on both edges here and actually put it up in this section. But remember, this end and this end are all end grain, and you're really not going to get much of a bond through that. The key is getting it on these big flat surfaces, which is face grain to face grain. So putting these together, I want to pull it up against my straight edge. So now I'm straight all the way across here. So now once our glue sets up, we have a nice straight line here. So if this were 8 feet long, it would be a nice straight joint. So once this is done and sanded, it'll look all but perfect. One of the most common joints in woodworking is mortise and tenon. And mortise and tenon's job is to replace this type of joinery. And that would be end grain up against either edge or face. End grain joinery is just not that strong. And though this could be supported by a dowel or a biscuit, the mortise and tenon is a much stronger joint, and when it's closed provides a very nice craftsman-like look to your project. Couple of things. The fit on a mortise and tenon joint, like any other joint, is important. The idea is that the fit should be tight enough that when put in, I don't have to pound it in with a hammer, but yet not so loose that it falls apart when I let go. I always like to begin by making the mortise first. There's 2 ways to make those. The first is on a drill press and using a Forstner bit like this and drilling overlapping holes like so. This does work. The problem is that it leaves these little striated marks inside, which show the seam between each one of those mortise plunges. And what you'll have to do is clean those up with a chisel. The problem I have is that the chisel will cause very different openings in here, very different widths, and it's much harder to get a nice clean fit. The second way to do this is by using a router bit like this and doing the mortise on a router table. The router bit creates a perfectly clean hole and exceptionally consistent. So I prefer this method over the drill press method with the Forstner bit. Either one works. I think that this works a lot better. So we've made the mortise first, and now it's time to make the tenon. Much like the mortise, there's multiple ways to make the tenons. The first is they can be made on a table saw using just a straight blade or a dado blade, and multiple passes are made over that wood to create a tenon like so. The problem with that method is that they leave, again, these little striated marks which don't provide as nice a gluing surface as a smooth surface would. So once these are done, these should be planed or sanded down to something smooth. The second way to do this is using that same table saw, but in this case using a jig on the table saw that you would run on the fence and slide over the blade on one side and then on the opposite side. What that will do is give you a much cleaner tenon like this. It has a really nice clean edge on it. This provides the perfect joint. The third way to do this is on a router table with a rabbiting bit. And this rabbiting bit will create a rabbet on here, again, doing the same thing and creating a nice smooth surface. Again, the goal behind any joinery is the smoother and the cleaner the surface, the better the joint. Once we've made the mortises, I can make all of these joints exactly the same when they're done on the table saw with this jig or when they're done on a router table with that bit. If I'm doing these with a dado blade or a single blade, all of them can vary very slightly because I'm going to have to come back and either plane or sand those. All of these methods work. The one that works the best for what I've been doing is one that's got a cleaner face, which was cut on either the table saw or on the router table. One last little tip before we do the assembly. A perfect mortise and a perfect tenon, when this joint is filled with glue, will not go together. because I haven't given any place for that glue to go. You can't compress a liquid, and that's why hydraulic systems work. So what I've done here is I've made a mortise slightly deeper or a tenon slightly shorter, so that there's a potential space at the bottom for that glue to sit. In this case, our mortise is about a 1/16, less than a half an inch. And here we have a tenon that's about a 1/16 more than a quarter. So I've got a little bit less than an 1/8 of an inch of space, and technically that's right here. Now once I've spread glue on the faces, you can put a little bit on this edge if you want to, but remember this is end grain against face grain, which is not a fairly strong joint. It's the glue on the face of this tenon and the inside of those smooth walls in the mortise that make this joint. So let me put the glue on, we'll assemble it, attach it there, and then finally, if there's glue squeeze out, use your rag to clean that up. And that is a completed mortise and tenon. Very clean lines across here. The joint is exceptionally strong. Again, a classic woodworking joint. This is how you do it. You'll be thrilled at how strong it is and how nice it looks. These represent some of the most popular joints in woodworking. The proper joint preparation and construction, along with the selection of a good glue, will make not only strong joints, but nice looking ones. Once you've mastered the construction of these and you put them into your regular woodworking repertoire, you'll be thrilled at not only the way they look, but how long they last.